Recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on the topic of this special order.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. June 14, 2017 was a dark stain on America's history. There are several of us in this room today who would not be here for 2 reasons. Number 1, and first and foremost, by the grace of God. And number 2, by the fact that then Majority Whip Steve Scalise showed up for practice that morning. Because without his security detail, none of us would be here. The deranged gunman that took for whatever revenge upon the Republicans on the baseball field that morning sought to give no mercy, just to create havoc. We know that we are better than the behavior that we saw that day. The bond that brought us all together, especially that day on the baseball team, spread, I believe, throughout the country to bring people together at a time when we needed it, and we continue to need it. When I mentioned Leader Scalise coming that day, he is only here because of the actions of one of our members, and that man is Representative Brad Winstrup, combat surgeon, dedicated soldier, and ready for the task at hand. As I personally witnessed, tending to Representative Scalise on the field, it was truly Brad's readiness and professionalism that enabled the life flight to occur and Scalise to successfully make it to the hospital. I commend Colonel Winstrup for what he did and the calm with which he did it. It is the calm, not the excitement, that drives us to the positive results. I cannot thank him enough as a personal friend and what he has done for the community as a whole to show what good behavior really means in the face of extreme adversity. I'm honored to be among my colleagues here tonight, and with that, I yield back.
Yields. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January the 9th, 2023, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Winstrup, is recognized as a designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank those that are here tonight to speak on the experience from that day. And I thought it would be appropriate that we start with Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan was one of the first to leave practice that day, and he will share his experience at this time.
I thank the gentleman for holding this special order to talk about what happened in 2017. 1 year ago tomorrow marks the day we had baseball practice right before the game. It's the day before the game, and Ron DeSantis, now governor of Florida, representative from that state, rode to the game with me every morning, or to the practice. And that morning, we were on the field. I was starting shortstop. Ron was starting third baseman. And as we did at every practice, we had infield practice, then we had batting practice, and then during batting practice, many of us were out there shagging balls. Ron was standing at third, I was standing at shortstop, and Ron said, "When are you thinking about leaving, Jeff?" He said, "I've got a meeting I could get to if we could head on." And I said, "Well, you've done infield and batting practice." I have, and Chairman Conaway, Mike Conaway from Texas, was in the batting cage batting. I said, "Let's let Chairman Conaway finish, and then we can go." Conaway finished. We ran off the field. I ran around the pitcher's mound. Steve Scalise was at second base. I fist bumped Steve as I went off the field, and Went to the dugout. Tom Rooney was at first base, and Tom said, "Duncan, what time is it?" So let me get my bag. I had a bag, kept keys, phone, and all that in. I came out, told him what time it was. Tom had to leave, so he left, and he was the first one out of the gate. Ryan DeSantis went off the field, and then I went off the field, and out in the parking lot, I was stopped by a gentleman who said, "Excuse me, can you tell me who's practicing today, Republicans or Democrats?" I said, "This is a Republican team practicing," and he said, "Thank you." Turned out that was the shooter. I was face to face with him for a brief interlude before he left the parking lot to go into his van by the YMCA and load his weapons and get prepared to fire about 137 rounds at my colleagues that I left on the baseball field that morning as I drove back to the Capitol. A lot of God winks in that event that morning. And I can't thank anyone but my Lord and Savior for getting me off that field and away from danger, because I would have been standing at shortstop. Ron DeSantis would have been at third base. Trent Kelly was the third baseman after Ron left, and the first shot was fired at Trent, hit a chain link fence, 1/8 of an inch. Definitely saved Trent's life. Rattled the gentleman, and I think it made him erratic to start shooting our colleagues, spraying bullets across the field that hit Steve Scalise and Zach Barth and Matt Micah and others. Turns out that the gentleman had come from Illinois to Washington area to assassinate Republicans. He had a list in his pocket with 6 or 8 names that he wanted to kill. My name was on that list, and I was face to face with him. And thank God he wasn't prepared at that moment, because he had targeted me specifically. My name, my address, my age, my physical description, a number of other things. So a lot of God winks on that field that day, and we're just thankful that no one died, especially our majority leader, Steve Scalise, my good friend, who the next year, after recovering from his wounds and coming out to the baseball field, had the first pitch on a live pitch baseball game off a bat hit directly to him. He was at second base. I was at shortstop. I came around to back him up behind the bag, and I was the first one there to take him in my arms and hug him and just praise God that he was there for that moment. I want to give, as I wrap up here, and give others a chance to share their memories. I'll give a special shout out to some heroes of that day, and that's David Bailey and Crystal Griner, who were there as Steve's detail, who actually fended off the shooter and kept, I think, much more harm from being done if that shooter had been able to get on the field. And then the Alexandria Police Department that showed up 11 minutes, 12 minutes after the shooting started. That's how quickly it happened. And dispatched the assassin, who the FBI said was hoping to die suicide by cop. No, he was an assassin. Let's call him what he was. He knew he'd probably die that day, but he wanted to take out as many Republicans as he could. And it was a tragic day that day, but it was special because no one died, everyone lived, and all the God winks that were there. So I thank the gentleman, and I yield back.
Thank you. There clearly was a lot of divine intervention. We entitled this event tonight, 6/14/2017, A Day of Infamy in America. Infamy, which means an evil act, and it truly was that. I remember watching Jeff Duncan leaving. I was out in the outfield, and I was thinking to myself, I usually have to leave early. Today I don't. I can stay longer. There were so many things that were divine intervention. I met the groundskeeper a couple months later. He said, I don't know why, but I locked the third base gate the night before. If that was open, he could have walked right in. The fences are 20 feet high. People can't just hop the fence and get out. Thank goodness for Steve Scalise. He took a bullet for all of us. The first shot rang out. It hit a link in the fence right by the bullpen. It was our last practice, so pitchers weren't in the bullpen. Another divine intervention. Trent Kelly, 2-star general, a couple tours overseas. At third base, he immediately cries out, there's a shooter. And everyone starts to disperse. And along the way, everybody was trying to help one another. Young man Matt Micah was hit severely in the side of his chest and out the front of his chest. Steve went down, and he was crawling towards the outfield. And then he came to a stop. And there he lay. In the meantime, everyone else was running to try and get out on the first base side, diving into the dugout, which served as a bunker as the shooter eventually started shooting above the bunker. You can see the bullet holes there today. We were blessed that David and Crystal were there, as was said, and the Alexandria police ultimately. They were both hit, actually. But they were there and saved our lives. I had changed my mind for some reason after I had batting practice. I was on my way back to the outfield, and I changed my mind and went down to the batting cage, which is outside the fence of the field. On the first base side, the shooter started on the third base side. Shot rang out about 7 o'clock in the morning. I got down on the ground. I served as a combat surgeon in Iraq. My instincts kicked in, and I'm thinking, who's doing the shooting? How many people are doing the shooting? God put me in a place where I could see the shooter, I could see the Capitol Police, I could see where everyone was, including Steve. I thank God for that. I thank God for that. When they eventually took him down, I was able to run out to Steve. There were 136 rounds fired that day. Most people don't know that. This went on for a while. Most people think, oh, a guy came along and fired a shot. It was far more than that. When I got to Steve, I was able to recognize that he was hurt worse than people might have thought because he was bleeding internally. We were able to slow down his bleeding. And the rest is history, that he was able to make it to the hospital. But when he got to the hospital, he no longer had a blood pressure. But they were able to save his life. A lot of miracles, a lot of sacrifice. It's kind of interesting that it happened around a baseball game, because baseball is the only sport I know that has a play called a sacrifice, where you give of yourself to advance another. And I saw so many people on the field that day doing whatever they could to help those that were hit. Paul Ryan came to the floor that day, said an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. And I agree. We are fortunate to be here today, all of us. And that's part of what we want to talk about today, is how grateful we are to God for the divine intervention that occurred for so many as we tell our story. It could have been far worse. And to think that in one morning, if Steve Scalise wasn't there, there's no Capitol Police, and this man could have walked onto that field, killing up to 20, 30 members of Congress and staff, possibly changing the balance of power in the House of Representatives in one morning. I contend that's an insurrection. That is an insurrection that we survived. And we're grateful. We stand here today grateful. And we don't want this day to be pushed aside in the books of history. This is bigger than that. God was on our side. We did everything we could for each other on that day. And that's an important message that we want to share with America. With that, I'd like to now introduce the manager of our baseball team. After a very successful stewardship of the baseball game last night, and I shared with this skipper, this is Representative Roger Williams of Texas, and I shared with him how someone last night before the game asked me, well, when this game comes around, do you think of the events of that day? And I said, I think of the events of that day every day of my life. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Brad, and it's special to be here tonight. Thank you for calling us together to remember this day. To me, it's like it was yesterday. I got up that morning just like we all did and got ready and went to practice. My situation was that I was hitting ground balls to Trent Kelly, and finished with Trent, went around and started hitting balls. I said to Scalise, I'm coming at you. And I remember I threw the ball up, and as soon as I hit it with the bat to Scalise, a shot went off. And little did I know that the shooter was probably 30 feet or 20 feet behind me. I did not know that. A shot went off, and Trent Kelly yelled, he's got a gun, head for cover. Well, when he said that, my instincts told me to get to the dugout. And fortunately for all of us, the dugouts were dugouts. They were dug in the ground, not like today where they're flat. And I remember I ran to the dugout and jumped, and it was like jumping in a swimming pool with no water. And I remember as I was in the air heading into the dugout, what went through my mind was, I'm not surprised because of the anger we have up here. When I hit the dugout, I slid all the way on the concrete to the dugout and slid into the arms of two of my teammates, Jeff Flake and Mo Brooks. And we three were in the corner, and as Brad said, this guy was firing, and there were actually some shells going into the dugout. Two of the coaches, Larry Hardy was in that dugout. Donnie Watson was in that dugout. And we were all trying to stay away from the action, and out of nowhere came my aide, who worked for me, who came with me to every batting practice, Zach Barth. And Zach had been in center field shagging balls, and when the shooting started, he ran to the right field foul pole to get as far away as he could from the shooter. But the shooter followed him and shot at him 10 times and missed him. And Zach decided the only way he was going to stay alive was to get to the dugout, and he ran to the dugout. And during that running from the right field line to the dugout, he got shot in the leg. And he dove into the dugout as I did, not knowing I was there. He dove in the dugout and dove right into my arms. And at that moment, you had a bonding of a 67-year-old man and a 24-year-old kid. And I held him in my arms, and he was saying, I'm hit, I'm hit. And Mo Brooks and I and Jeff Flake were there. We didn't know what to do. We didn't have the experience that Dr. Winstrup or the others had, but God kicked in. Mo Brooks removed his belt, and we tightened it around his leg to stop the bleeding. And we all hunkered down. And then we heard that Scalise was down. We couldn't see it. We were in the dugout, but we heard that Steve had been hit. And these shots were going off, and we didn't hear anything from the Capitol Police. And we thought, in our situation, we thought they'd probably have been killed. And we decided if this guy came around to where we were going to charge him. Maybe it would work, maybe it wouldn't, but we'd made that commitment to each other that we would do that. And then we heard the sirens, and we were praying for sirens. And when you're praying for sirens, it takes a long time, but we heard the sirens came, which told us people knew we were in trouble. It was the Arlington police. And when they got there, we heard shooting, not just an AK-47 going off. We heard 9mm that were going off. Praise God for Crystal Griner and David Bailey. I remember being in the dugout looking up, and David Bailey was straddling the dugout and shooting like this at the perpetrator to keep him from coming around to the rest of us. And finally it ended. And I remember somebody started yelling, everybody out of the dugout, everybody out of the dugout. And I told the guys I was with, I'm not getting out of the dugout. I don't know who that is. I'm staying here. And then about that time we saw the police, and we got out of the dugout. Helicopter, I think, had come to get Steve, if I remember. A lot of chaos. People gathered around together. Dr. Winstrup saw me, and I'd been injured in the ankle, and he called an ambulance for me and said, get him to the hospital. And it's the first time I'd ever been in an ambulance, and they took me to the hospital. That night I was in the hospital. Brad came to see me. I'll never forget that. President Trump called me, and Vice President Pence called me. He said, should we play the game? I tomorrow? I said, absolutely. We can't let this end like this. And my situation, I got hit with shrapnel, and Dr. Winstrup knows exactly what I had, but had a lot of treatment, and there was a decision made that if I didn't get better 2 weeks, that I might lose my leg. So it was a life changer for all of us. But Steve Scalise and Brad Winstrup showed courage like I've never seen. And even today they show that courage. But we had, 25 guys and gals. I mean, we all have our story, and everybody did their thing. But there were angels that day. And the angels that lock you talked about. And the angel was something as small as David Bailey's cell phone. And David reached to get his cell phone and move it up because David thought we were surrounded by ISIS, which would have been a whole other story. He thought we were surrounded by ISIS. He reached here to call for help and got hit. Got hit in the phone. If it hadn't hit his phone, it might have hit him in the side. It might have been a whole different story. He may not have made it. But I think that was an angel. I think the lock was an angel. It reminded me God was in charge. It could have been just the opposite. I remember in the dugout as the shooting was going on, two things went through my mind. First of all, people asked me, Roger, are you afraid to die? I was not afraid of dying. But I did hope that my wife remembered I want the song, Put Me in Coach, I'm Ready to Play at my funeral. And I wanted to make sure I made it because I had a granddaughter coming in October. So God was in charge. He took care of us. The perpetrator paid for his act. The Arlington police saved us. David Bailey saved us. Crystal Griner saved us. And for that, we're all owing to them for the rest of our lives. And it's not often you get to hug somebody that saved your life and be able to thank them like we were able to. But it's a day I'll never forget, and like Brad says and the others, it just doesn't come along on this day. You wake up every morning thinking about it. And every time we have baseball practice, you think about it. And those of us who were there wear bracelets. We wear bracelets today that have the date of the shooting that say, "In God we trust." So it's a day I'll never forget. I'm thankful for God for letting us have another chance. As Brad said, there were several articles written about the shooting. One article I read was a day that talked about if it had gone just the opposite, things politically, things in the world would have been much, much different. But they weren't. And because of people like David Bailey, Crystal Griner, and Brad and others, the Arlington police, I get to see my granddaughter. I get to still coach the baseball team. I get to still be in Congress. I get to still love my wife. And for that, I'm grateful. But at the end of the day, we can do better than this. People should not be that angry. And that's a goal we should have as we're in Congress, to agree to disagree and not go out and kill people. And I'll just end this with I end all my speeches. In God we trust. Praise the Lord. God bless America. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Greatly appreciated. Now we're going to hear from Mr. Barry Loudermilk, who was there that day, and one of several who not only was there and survived, but participated in helping others throughout that entire time. Mr. Loudermilk.
Thank my good friend Brad for this moment. I think back to that day. At noon, when we gathered into this chamber, I sat right over here in the front row. Speaker Paul Ryan went to the podium, and as was said already, he said an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. As I look around the chamber, not much has changed from that day to today. The carpet's the same, the chairs are the same, some of the people are the same. But none of us who were on the field that day are the same. It's had an impact on all of us. As you just heard Coach Williams tell his story, we all have the same story, but different perspective. Some of it is physically. We were in different locations, as I was in a different location than Representative Winstrup, who was in a different location than our coach. But we all experienced the same thing. And one thing that you will hear that is consistent is the miracles that happened that day. One of the things that this has had an impact on me, as we have all dealt with some level of traumatic stress afterwards, but this has built my faith. Hebrews 11:1 says that faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things unseen. None of us saw angels on the field deflecting bullets that day. None of us were there when an angel spoke to the groundskeeper the night before and impressed upon him to lock the gate on the third base side of that field. Had he had not called a groundskeeper at 9 o'clock the evening before our practice and had not chain locked that gate, that shooter would have gotten on the field and it would have been a different story. We didn't see the angels conducting the miracles, but the evidence was there. I was standing at home plate. I had just put on a batting helmet, and I was waiting on my turn to step into the batter's box and take some live pitching. Rodney Davis was there ahead of us, and he was hitting. And as I was standing there, I heard the distinct sound of the report of a firearm. Now, where I live in Georgia, that's not unusual. I'm working in the backyard. I hear shots all the time. People sighting in the rifles, doing target practicing. So I didn't think much about it at the moment, but then I realized I'm not at home in Georgia. I'm in Alexandria, Virginia. Why am I hearing a gunshot? The next sound I heard was our third baseman, Trent Kelly, holler, "He's got a gun, run." At that moment, I started running up the first baseline. Many of my colleagues, as you heard, went into the dugout, but as one of the veterans, immediately my training kicked in, and I thought, this is not a great place to go in case the shooter gets on the field. However, to get off the field would expose me longer, but I decided to head past the dugout and go out the gate. As I'm running, I see the ground erupting on each side of me, and I realize that the shooter was targeting me at that moment. As I reached the gate, I turned to go out of the field, and I heard the sound of a round hitting the fence post next to me. Right outside the gate, there, about 20 feet outside the gate, is a wooden shed. My training started coming back to me. That's when you're under assault, seek concealment, find the aggressor. If you have a means to fight back, fight back. If not, plan an escape route and get to safety. Those things were running through my mind. I saw the shed. I went behind the shed, but I couldn't see where the shooter was because he was down the first baseline. I needed to get where I could see the shooter. As I rounded the corner of the shed where I'm looking back down toward the backstop, that's when I see one of our staff members, Matt Micah, walk around the other side of the shed, already covered in blood, and lay down next to the Capitol Police SUV. At that moment, I realized I can't escape now. I have a colleague who's down. I have to stay and help him. I jumped up and started to run to him when Brian Kelly, another staff member who had gone around the side of the shed with me, he hollered, "Barry, get down, get down." As I went down to my knees, I heard the sound of a bullet go right past my head and hit the shed next to me. I didn't realize it, but the shooter had come around the back of the backstop and had targeted where I was and Brian Kelly. As I went down, I saw David Bailey and Crystal Griner come around the back of the SUV, both of them trying to engage with the shooter. Within a couple of moments, the shooter came around the backstop, was next to a concrete building, and started shooting underneath the SUV. One of the rounds hit Crystal Griner in the ankle, and I saw her immediately go down. David Bailey then would walk out and expose himself so the shooter would turn and start targeting him to give us an opportunity to hopefully get to Matt Micah and Crystal Griner. However, every time we would start to try to move up to help them, he would turn and start shooting back at us again. What seemed like an eternity, the gunfire was going over and over again. Bullets would run the ground right next to us, but we stayed there. Brian Kelly and I stayed there because I wasn't going to leave Matt alone. Finally, I saw David Bailey's pants flutter, and he started to limp, and I realized he had just taken a round in the leg. As we found out later, he had actually taken some shrapnel where a bullet went ricocheted off of a car's wheel. When I realized that if David Bailey goes down, the shooter's coming directly to us. But within a few moments, we heard another distinct sound of a different type of firearm. It was the Alexandria police had arrived. But as I stood there and I looked, David Bailey fully exposed himself as the shooter came around the other side of this concrete building and was standing there shooting at David Bailey as he was returning fire, saying, "Drop the weapon, drop the weapon, drop the weapon." It was about that moment the Alexandria police then took down the shooter. My immediate reaction was to go to Matt Micah and help him. But with a gaping hole in his chest, I thought I could do more damage than good trying to put pressure on it. But I knew one thing I could do: I could pray for it. And so I laid my hands on Matt, and we prayed. I don't remember what I said that day, but then I realized the SUV has to have a medical kit in it. So I asked Crystal Griner, do you have a medical bag? And she said, yes, it's in the bags. I got up and I ran around, and by the time I pulled the medical bag out, I was astonished when I came back around the SUV, the paramedics were already there with Matt Micah. I was surprised they were there that fast. I didn't realize Steve Scalise had been shot at that moment, but I looked and there was a crowd gathered out on the field, and someone told me he was there. I ran out to the field and I dropped the bag off to Brad and the others who were on the field, and I looked, and I don't know how he got there, but David Bailey was there checking on Steve Scalise. He still didn't realize he had been hit in the leg, and he was trying to walk off the field by himself, so I helped David walk off the field, and that was one of the most memorable moments. As others have said, if it had not been the heroism of David Bailey and Crystal Griner, we would not be here today. If it wasn't for the brotherhood and the camaraderie of all of us supporting each other, things would be a lot different here today as well. I think it's interesting that we're discussing this just a few days after the 80th anniversary of D-Day. My father was a medic in World War II, and he landed at D-Day. And one of the things that he used to tell me as a child, he said, brothers who share a foxhole, or friends who share a foxhole, are brothers for life. There's a bond between all of us here that cannot be broken, cannot be shaken. Did that day change me? Yes. I had the choice to let it negatively affect me or to positively affect my future. And I chose the positive. Look for the positive. Make positive change. And I believe that we have done that. We are stronger because of it. Well, I think we are wiser for it, but we're also more dedicated to one another to see each other through these things. Regardless of when some of us leave this great institution, we will never spiritually leave one another. God bless all of you, and thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Barry. You know, I'm grateful for you bringing that bag of medical supplies from the Capitol Police van because there were things in there I needed, and we were able to put a clotting bandage on, use a better tourniquet than a belt, and we started supplying liquids to Steve to help sustain him. Also helping me right there was Mr. Gary Palmer. And next we're going to hear from Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Brad, for giving us this opportunity to reflect on the events of June 14th, 2017. Regardless of what we do the rest of our lives, that day will bind us together, those who were there that day. The interesting thing is the day before I saw the man who attacked us. He was sitting in the bleachers behind the backstop, looking, in my opinion, very distressed. And I thought about going over talking with him, but we were trying to get to practice and get practice started. So I didn't see him again until later. As Congressman Duncan related, I was actually over at second base with Scalise when Duncan and Ron DeSantis left. Trent Kelly was already over at third base, so I moved over to shortstop. And our practices are a lot of banter back and forth at each other. It's a lot of fun. A lot of ragging each other. And all that was going on. And then I heard a sharp crack. And I immediately recognized it as a gunshot. And I yelled at Trent Kelly that it was a gunshot. And Trent said, "I know." And the bullet had whizzed by him by the providence of God, by an act of God. That bullet had struck a link in the chain link fence. The shooter, after he had asked Duncan if we were Republicans or Democrats, walked over to his van, which he had been living in his van for about 3 months, and parked in the parking lot of the YMCA across the street from the field, and they were doing some construction. There were some little containers there that blocked our view of anyone approaching from that side. And so he came up on the outfield end of the third base dugout, and maybe about 5 feet from the fence, fired that first shot. And there was a few seconds hesitation before anything else happened. It was almost like it was just a single shot. And when I yelled out at Trent, Trent turned around and saw him, and he yelled out, "He's got a gun, get off the field." And everyone was kind of stunned. Things just kind of froze for a moment until the gunfire erupted. And so we're the only open gate, and thank God the third base gate was closed, but the only open gate was on the first base side, and so we're all running in that direction. Others, I remember seeing General Bergman, Jack Bergman, lying flat on the ground up by home plate, along with Mike Bishop from Michigan. Others scrambling to get into the dugout. And I saw Scalise get hit. I knew he was hit low. I didn't know where, but I knew he was hit low because of the way he fell. And as I was running across the infield trying to get off the field, I had two thoughts that went through my mind. One was, if today's the day, I'm ready. And then I thought, I wonder what it'll feel like. As I got off the field, took cover behind a big oak tree that was really between where the little building where Barry Loudermilk and the other guys had taken shelter, and that concrete block building where the shooter had taken a position. And I saw Crystal Griner on the ground, and from the blood on her leg, I thought she was shot in the leg. Turns out she was shot through the ankle. And she was trying to pull herself up toward the front wheel well of the SUV to, I think, try to get in a position to return fire. And behind the oak tree was Trent Kelly and John Molinar from Michigan. And I don't know who said it, but someone said we needed to pull back to a concrete block building behind us, as where the concession stands were, where the restrooms were. And when I pulled back, got back there, I took a position beside Brad Winstrup. And Brad and I were at that corner, and Scalise had dragged himself with his hands and arms out of the infield, out in the outfield. He had started, when he started doing that, when I was still by the oak tree, he kept raising up, trying to look. I think he was trying to see where he was shot. And I started yelling at him to get down, because bullets were flying everywhere. And when he got out in the outfield, he just lay quietly. And Brad would yell out at him, "Raise your hand," for a show of life. And Steve would raise his hand. So we were praying that this would end so that we could get to Steve in time to give aid. Thankfully, someone yelled out, "He's down, he's down." And Brad, and there were about, Brad, 5 or 6 of us that got out there. And when I saw where he was shot, I knew he was in trouble. I knew that there'd be bone fragments. I knew there'd be lead fragments. And I also knew that I had no clue what to do other than put pressure on the wound. Barry Louderman brought the first aid kit out and gave it to me. And I opened it up and was providing Brad with whatever materials that we could find in the bag. Brad fashioned a lower body tourniquet out of by getting Scalise's baseball belt off, and Brian Kelly took his shirt off and was able to make that tourniquet. And then when the EMT showed up, they actually had one, but it was my understanding that Brad was the only one who knew expertly how to put it on, and he got it on, and that's, in my opinion, what saved Steve's life. Now, these are individual actions that I think were guided by the hand of God, because there is no other explanation for why, when 136 rounds were fired at people congregated like we were, 5 people were hit, 5 victims, but none of them died. The only person who died that day was the shooter. The other thing that struck me was the members' reaction. There was nobody screaming, nobody panicked. Now, you hear a lot of times what people talk about in combat or in these type situations. Police officers talk about this, time slows down. It just seemed like everything was so focused. And as soon as the shooter was down, our members sprang into action, helping each other. I was so proud of how our guys responded and didn't panic, because it was certainly a situation where I think most people would have panicked. Congressman Loudermilk mentioned David Bailey being wounded. When Bailey came out to be by the side of Steve Scalise, I offered to try to tend to his wound, and he refused treatment. He would not leave the side of Steve Scalise. The epilogue, I guess, of this is how it's affected us, and I think it's made our bond even stronger. As I said at the very beginning, we're bound together for life. It's a wonderful relationship that we have with each other as members of Congress, as members of the Republican baseball team. But this is an event that defines us in many respects. And I'll never forget it. But the epilogue is the disappointing part of the story. There's no doubt in my mind this was an act of political violence It was clearly an attempt, a planned attempt to kill Republican members of Congress. When we had a briefing by the FBI, and Steve Scalise had gotten out of rehab, it was several months after the shooting, and they gathered us in a room to have the FBI give us the report, and they told us that this was an act of an individual attempting to commit suicide by police. I want you to remember that both the Capitol police officers were shot. When the Alexandria police showed up and fired on him initially, he returned fire on them. If this was his intention to commit suicide by a cop, he wouldn't have been firing on them. He came there to kill Republicans. It was one of the most shameful days, in my opinion, for the FBI to come before us and Steve Scalise sitting in a scooter because he was still not able to walk, sitting right in front of him and to read a report to us that wanted to describe this, categorize this as an attempted suicide. I am so grateful to Brad Winstrup, who has refused to accept that and has continued to pursue the truth and to get the FBI to classify this as what it was, because the truth needs to be told. But also, there's more to the story. As Scalise continued his rehabilitation at MedStar Hospital, and there's another part of this story too. When the ambulance arrived to take Scalise to George Washington Hospital, there was so much traffic, it became evident because, as Brad pointed out, Steve's blood pressure was basically zero. He had minutes, not hours. It was evident they were not going to get there, and a helicopter flew over. I believe it was a Department of Interior helicopter, and they radioed the helicopter to land at the baseball field, and it did. They took Steve out of the ambulance, put him in the helicopter, and the only place that had a pad for the helicopter to land was MedStar Hospital. So they took him there, and it just so happened, again, I believe the providence of God, one of the top trauma surgeons in the country was on call. And still, for 2 days, we didn't know if Steve was going to make it. When he did his rehab, Steve is a huge LSU fan. Some of us even went to great lengths to encourage him by putting on an LSU cap. As someone who, in my case, played football at Alabama, that was a one-time event. I told Steve I'd never do that again. But I knew how much LSU football meant to him, and it happened that fall, LSU was playing at the University of Alabama. So I called the university and asked them to invite Steve Scalise to be our guest at that game, because Steve is the kind of guy, you give him an objective and he will achieve it. So I had the honor of hand-delivering a letter of invitation from Coach Nick Saban to Steve in the hospital. Coach Saban and Steve knew each other from the time when Saban was the head coach at LSU. And I stood there as he ripped open the envelope and read the letter. And Steve Scalise was at the University of Alabama for the LSU-Alabama football game. We beat them, which we usually do. But it was one of the great moments for me to go through this tragic event, see this guy fight for his life, achieve an objective, come back on this floor, stand at this microphone, and give one of the greatest speeches I've ever heard on the floor of the House of Representatives. So in conclusion, I think we all understand what happened that day. We understand the condition of our country right now, the anger, the division that could potentially tear us apart. I don't think we need to be reminded of the responsibility we have in conducting the affairs of the governance of this country in a way that not only allows us to continue to function as a nation, but restores respect for the chamber, restores respect for the separation of powers, restores respect for our ability to disagree but still live together. Tomorrow, as we said, is the 7th year anniversary of that event. I know, as my colleagues and have all said, it's a day we'll never forget, but I hope, as tragic as that day was, that it will serve as a reminder to every member of this body, Democratic and Republican, that we have a responsibility in how we conduct our business, how we present our arguments, and that we dedicate ourselves to trying to bring unity back in a country that right now is just stricken with anger and malice, that if we don't deal with it properly, is going to do enormous harm to our ability to live together, to govern together, and to give those who follow us an opportunity to live in what is the greatest country in the history of the world. With that, Congressman Winstrup, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Palmer, and I want to thank all my colleagues that participated in this event tonight. You know, people ask me, you know, what's your greatest memory of your time in Congress? And I tell people, it's the day that Steve Scalise walked back on this floor. Truly is. And I want to thank those who are watching, listening tonight. I encourage people to read Steve's book. Maybe I shouldn't say this on the floor. I don't know. It's a great book, and it really sums up all the miracles of the day. It's called Back in the Game. But look, you've heard from a lot of people tonight. Very touching stories, sentimental to all of us. A lot of lessons learned. But it is pretty interesting. If you listen to everybody, you recognize that we went to a baseball practice. And as a result, we carved out our chapter in history and affirmed our faith in God. I yield back.